Welcome to HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Overviews. This video will discuss the building blocks of the Housing Choice Voucher funding process. Understanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program funding can assist PHAs when making decisions around leasing and spending practices in order to ensure that the PHA maximizes assistance provided to low-income families within program financial constraints. The Housing Choice Voucher, or HCV program, is HUD's largest rental assistance program and receives its funding through Congressional appropriations. HUD then allocates appropriated budget authority to individual housing authorities. HUD has authority to provide adjustments to PHA's allocation for certain approved categories that will be discussed. Funding is allocated on a calendar year and is primarily provided for HCV renewals and administrative fees. HUD is required to provide renewal funding based on validated leasing and cost data reported by PHAs in the Voucher Management System, or VMS. PHAs are funded on a budget-based basis, also referred to as re-benchmarking, which means a PHA's prior year spending determines the following year's budget authority. In other words, spend more, the more renewal dollars will increase the following year. Congress annually provides funding for vouchers through the appropriations process. PHA renewal allocations are calculated per the Federal Appropriations Act, which requires that HUD apply a re-benchmarking renewal formula based on validated leasing and cost data in VMS each calendar year to calculate each PHA's renewal allocation. Agencies receive voucher renewal funding each year based on the spending in the prior year. A PHA will not be funded for more vouchers than they have under their annual contributions contract, or ACC. If Congress provides less renewal funding than agencies are due, each agency's funding is reduced proportionately. This aspect of renewal calculation is known as proration. Proration percentages, when applicable, are typically above 99%. Another variable in the renewal calculation is the Renewal Funding Inflation Factor, RFIF. Renewal funding inflation factors are used to adjust renewal funding for the HCV program of each PHA. The adjustment accounts for national inflation and individual local area inflation by analyzing program data, market fluctuations, and the overall current economic environment. Each year, HUD publishes fair market rents for areas all across the country. These are intended to represent the cost to rent a moderately priced dwelling unit in the local housing market. Broadly, the inflation factor is roughly equal to the movement in a PHA's FMRs year to year. One of the fundamental challenges with funding is timing. Since a PHA's allocation is tied to a congressional budget, any delay in passing the federal budget creates a challenge to PHA's budget planning. Since 2008, PHAs often receive their HCV funding letter in March or later, meaning the PHA has to account for an uncertainty in their funding allocations while still maintaining the programs for a quarter of the year or longer. The challenges to PHA spending management and forecasting are mitigated using the two-year tool. In general, HUD provides renewal funding through the following steps. Step 1. A new baseline is established based on all validated leasing and cost data from the prior calendar year, capped at the ACC. Step 2. As required by the Appropriations Act, HUD adjusts allocations for the first-time renewals of tenant protection vouchers and special purpose vouchers, or SPVs. Step 3. The Renewal Funding Inflation Factor, or RFIF. A PHA-specific number is applied to PHA's calculated 12-month renewal requirement after all adjustments have been applied under Steps 1 and 2. The RFIFs are published by HUD's Office of Policy, Development, and Research, PD&R, and can be found at the following website: Step 4. HUD determines the total HAP renewal funding eligibility for all PHAs and compares that amount to the total HAP renewal funds available per the most current Consolidated Appropriations Act to determine the proration factor. This proration factor is then applied to each PHA's calendar year eligibility. Step 5. The Appropriations Act provides that HUD may offset PHA's allocations based on the excess amounts of a PHA's total reserves, including PHA-held restricted net position and HUD-held reserves on 12/31 of the prior year. PHA-held R&P funds are HAP funds distributed by HUD to the PHA but not yet spent by the PHA. HUD-held reserves, which are usually the larger part of the total reserves, are funds allocated for the PHA but unspent and not dispersed from HUD, hence HUD-held reserves. Detailed calculations of the offsets will be provided to impacted PHAs in the renewal allocation enclosure. Offsets will come from excess program reserves reconciled at the end of a calendar year. Historically, HUD has been given the authority to offset excess reserves to, number 1, increase the national proration factor, and 2, to increase funds available for shortfalls. There are certain protected categories that are taken into account prior to offset. These have historically included, among others, a safe level of PHA reserves based on size, funding needed to cover increased leasing and per-unit costs later in the year, amounts needed to fully lease VASH. If HUD does an offset, the full details of the offset reallocation will be available in the PIH notice for implementation of the federal funding provisions for the Housing Choice Voucher program for each fiscal year. Let's take a look at an example scenario. A PHA spent $5,030,000 on housing assistance payments in the prior year, as recorded in VMS, and did not overlease on their ACC. The current renewal funding inflation factor is calculated to be 4.8%. HUD determines the proration factor to be 99.8%. In this example, there are no offsets. A PHA's funding allocation eligibility for the upcoming calendar year would be calculated by multiplying the prior year spending amount of $5,030,000 by 4.8% to determine the inflation factor. In this example, the inflation amount of $241,440 would be added to the $5,030,000 for a total of $5,271,440. This figure is then multiplied by the proration factor of 99.8%, since Congress did not allocate sufficient funding to fund each PHA fully. The resulting amount of $5,260,897 is the renewal budget authority for the current year. What happens if a PHA spends less? Had the PHA in this example only spent $4,024,000 on its funding renewal, the following year's program funding would be about $4,208,718, over $1,052,000 less than the current year. While the unspent allocation from the prior year rolls over to reserves, this reserve is subject to potential offset. Additionally, and more importantly, that money wasn't used to assist low-income families in the PHA's community. Finally, money sitting in reserves is not subject to the inflation factor as money that was spent as HAP would be, resulting in another potential loss of dollars for the PHA. HUD has authority to provide adjustments to PHA's allocation based on certain categories. Awards will be made to eligible PHAs in accordance with need, as determined by HUD following an application by the PHA. Set-aside eligibility requirements, application process, and application submission deadlines vary according to category. Annual PIH notices provide yearly requirements. The following 6 categories for set-aside categories illustrate possible adjustments. Category 1. Prevention of terminations due to insufficient funding, shortfall, for PHAs that, despite taking reasonable cost-saving measures, would otherwise be required to terminate participating families from the program due to insufficient funds. Category 2A. Unforeseen circumstances. An unforeseen circumstance is an occurrence within or after the re-benchmarking period which the PHA could not reasonably have anticipated and which was out of the PHA's control. Category 2B, portability. To be eligible for funding under this category, the PHA must have experienced a significant increase in renewal cost due to portability for tenant-based rental assistance under Section 8R of the Act. Category 3, project-based vouchers. Vouchers were not in use during the re-benchmarking period in order to be available to meet a commitment for PB vouchers assistance. Category 4, HUD-VASH. For PHAs administering HUD-VASH vouchers that can demonstrate a need for adjustment funding for at least one of the following situations. Per unit cost increase. Program-wide funded calendar year HAP per unit cost increase is less than the current VASH HAP per unit cost increase. Leasing increase. For PHAs whose total HUD-VASH leasing for a calendar year will exceed the leasing level included in their renewal funding, plus the leasing that will be supported by the R&P and HUD-held program reserves. Category 5. Lower than average leasing. To be eligible for funding under this category, the PHA must be leasing a lower than average percentage of their authorized vouchers, have low amounts of budget authority in their net restricted asset accounts, and HUD-held programmatic reserves relative to other agencies and are not participating in the MTW demonstration. Category 6. Disaster. The PHA must have experienced increased cost or loss of units in an area for which the President declared a disaster under Title IV of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act in previous or current calendar year. Depending on the number of applications and amount of total eligibility, HUD reserves the right to prioritize awards for this set-aside category and may need to prorate eligibility for other categories of the set-aside. For more information on how to apply for this set-aside and eligibility requirements, see the most recent PIH notice for implementation of the federal funding provisions for the Housing Choice Voucher program. Under a budget-based model, effectively forecasting and managing a PHA's budget and spending will impact the following year's renewal budget authority. Not fully utilizing allocation of HAP funds places agency at risk of losing future allocation of federal funds, resulting in fewer low-income families being served. PHAs should lease as close as possible to their capacity without incurring a shortfall or exceeding the PHA's unit baseline. PHAs should use the 2-year tool and update the data regularly to see the families that can be supported with available funding in the current and future years. This concludes the presentation on HUD's Housing Choice Vouchers Funding Overview. Please check out the full series of webinars at the link to learn more about the basics of Housing Voucher Program.